Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mr. Chairman, Yang Berhormat Saleh Sungip, my dear friend Dr. Azhar, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. I think I'll start my speech today by first quoting from one of the great reformer in the history of Islam, that is Jamaluddin al-Afghani. Jamaluddin al-Afghani said, "So long as humans exist, the struggle will not cease between dogma and free investigation, between religion and philosophy, a desperate struggle in which I fear the triumph will not be for free thought, because the masses dislike reason, and its teaching are only understood by some intelligences of the elite." Jamaluddin Afghani. And we see that the most intriguing part of Afghani's focus on the decline of Islamic civilization is not the most intriguing part of Afghani's focus on the decline of Islamic civilization is not in who he blames for the decline, but in how he proposes to reverse that decline. So from this perspective, an observer can accurately dissect the mechanism which influenced Afghani's ideas about civilizational decline. It reveals that Afghani is not simply criticizing religious orthodoxy in the Muslim world in his reply to Renan. Rather, he is criticizing the way in which the ulama or the scholars use religious orthodoxy as a means to maintain intellectual stagnation. As a result, the innovation of absolute monarchy is easily co-opted into the political system of the Islamic civilization and defended by the ulama as being Islamic. We even heard just yesterday that the Fatwa Council issued an edict that Muslims should give their support to the uncivilized act of Jais, raiding the Bible Society and confiscated their Bible. It is apparent that the sanction on philosophical endeavors is the root of decay in Islamic religion and society. It is to this purpose which Afghani points his criticism to Renan. In his book Reply to Renan, Jamaluddin Afghani's response to Renan's lecture on Islam and Science, published on the 29th of March 1888. Afghani challenges Renan's thesis that Arabs, by nature of their race, society and religion, have always been incapable of developing rational thought. While the Islamic world is currently underdeveloped in scientific advancements and rational thought, Afghani counters, this has not always been the case. Afghani asserts that Renan's thesis is unscientific because it does not take into consideration the fact that all religious institutions have opposed free thought at some point in their history. And we heard about how Christianity evolved and how this Protestant movement came about. The challenge we are facing today is similar to the challenge that has been faced by the Reformist generation before us, the intellectual stagnation. When we promote Islamic reform, it doesn't mean that we are reforming the tenets of religion itself. Reform is basically reforming the understanding of how religion should be practiced in this 21st century. It would not be a gross exaggeration to portray it as a re-emergence of the rationalist school of thought, or known previously, as I mentioned before, as the Mu'tazilites in the Islamic world. As the rationalists believe that one of God's crucial attributes is justice. Hence, man must have free will. Man must utilize his God-given faculty of reason to decipher between right and wrong and to establish justice. The verse that forms the tagline of Islamic Renaissance Fund, لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, for people who think, is to emphasize the importance of akal, or reason. As stated time and again by one of the greatest thinkers in Islamic history, Al-Ustazul Imam Muhammad Abduh, there can be no contradiction between faith and reason. If there appears to be some contradiction between reason and revelation, it should be assumed that one or the other has been incorrectly understood, since they are basically two different means to convey the one divine truth. Real tajdeed, or renewal, and islah, or reform, can only be achieved if we are able to fully utilize our faculty of intellect, or akal. There are certain groups of people within our societies that are propagating tajdeed agenda. However, these people will often present themselves as the only true followers of the Salafi principles or the pious predecessors, made a literal and reductionist approach towards the understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah, or the tradition of the Prophet. The contemporary literalist approach fails to give adequate answers to contemporary challenges. These so-called true Salafis fail to make a clear distinction between what is known as al-zawabit, or the immutables, and al-mutaghayyirat, or the changing, like politics and economy. They are more obsessed with returning to the past, back to the time of as-salaf as-salih, what I said as the pious predecessors, rather than confronting the issues by exercising the faculty of reason endowed by Allah. Confusion exists between principles and models, between a rule and its form, and this leads to exceedingly rigid and particularly exclusive reductions. Thus, modesty is prescribed to Muslims, but in the eyes of the literalist, only one way of being modest exists. That is by imitating the Prophet, his companions, and the Salaf, whom they considered as the first 300 years of Islam. Dressing just as they did, with the same clothes, and this is the only possible reference. It can be seen here how the principle of modesty is reduced to its actualization within a specific historical context. One could understand and accept such reduction if its advocates only express it for themselves. However, they do not, and that exclusive approach has been fitted out with legal constructs to disqualify all other interpretations. By failing to distinguish sufficiently between the immutable and the changing, contemporary literalists, or what I term them as Salafiyya Harfiyya, bestow a series of other confusions involving grave consequences. For on the level of relationship within human societies, distinguishing between the immutable and the mutable makes it possible to draw a fundamental difference between what we call as principles and models. Thus, the principles of justice, equality, rights, and human brotherhood that guided the Prophet of Islam indeed remain the references beyond history, but the model of the city of Medina, founded by the Prophet in the 7th century, is a historical realization linked to the realities and requirements of his time. To confuse eternal principles and historical models is simplistic. Idealizing something in a moment of history reduces the universality of Islamic principles to the dream of an impossible origin, or impossible return to the past, to an irresponsible nostalgia of origins. If we look at the Golden Age, it was not a period of nostalgia which saw centuries of science, art, and discovery flourish. Indeed, the freedom to think, express, and to risk original ideas defined the many Muslim civilizations that prospered across the Islamic world, from Baghdad to Spain in the west, and India, China, and Nusantara in the east. Take, for example, the advances under the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th century, which saw the rise of algebra, astronomy, medicine, literature, and even agricultural technology advances which are still considered to be far ahead of its time. These advances did not emerge de novo, did not emerge from nowhere, but were born in conversation with knowledge inherited from the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Chinese, and the Indians. But the culture of exploration and experimentation can also be found in the noble ideas about religion that also flourished then. It was during this era, right, the era of the Muslim world became the intellectual center for learning, during which the famous House of Wisdom, or Baitul Hikmah, was established. And that was the time of the Mu'tazilites. Muslims and non-Muslims worked together, hand in hand, to translate and gather all the possible knowledge that was within reach to them at that time into Arabic. The underlying basis of this intellectual culture at that time was none other than the Mu'tazilite school of rational technology. They were inspired by hadith and Quranic verses that emphasized the value of knowledge, reflection, and discovery in Islam. That is why one of the famous hadiths of the Mu'tazilite was this hadith by the Prophet that the might of a pen, a pen is mightier than the sword. Yeah. So the Mu'tazilite school of thought claim, among other things, that humans have total free will, that our actions were not predetermined. They do so to protect God's total innocence of any evil in this world, while reserving all responsibility for evil deeds to humans. In other words, humans must have the power to choose their actions in order to be held accountable for them. We are accountable for our actions, for our deeds. Thus, humans will receive the appropriate reward in heaven or punishment in hell as a result of their good or bad free choices. This commitment to human autonomy and to God's supreme transcendence also led them to conclude that the Quran was created and not uncreated. Otherwise, it would be elevated almost to the level of a second deity, something that contradicts uncompromising monotheism. This led to an important conclusion in that a created Al-Quran can be interpreted, whereas an uncreated Al-Quran can only be applied. And that is the problem that we are facing nowadays. As strange as all this may sound to contemporary Muslims, it is nonetheless a historical fact that the Mu'tazilites endured as the most dominant school of theology in Baghdad for nearly 3 centuries. Hence, the idea of freedom, be it freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, or freedom to read whatever they want to read, was not unknown in classical Islamdom. The people of reason clearly aspired to it, and they may have headed toward establishing a genuine concept of hurriyah, or freedom. Nowadays, even Irshad Manji's books were being banned in this country from being read. Today, contemporary Muslims only hark back to our past military conquests for simplistic proof of Islam's historical glory, when the reality is that those were only far in between, few and far in between. What is undeniable is the depth of learning and exploration that Muslims throughout the world pioneered over centuries, and this could only have been possible because of the love of learning that was part and parcel of Muslim culture then. This is, of course, not to paint a perfect and rosy picture of the past, but it does suggest that the notion of Muslim progress need not be defined in terms of state power or control over the life of others, like what we are doing right now, but genuine inquiry, exploration of knowledge, and discovery of the world. All this is, of course, a stark contrast to the reality today, when conformity, often by coercion, has become the norm in Muslim societies, especially in this country. Muslims are expected to simply obey and listen to authorities who are effectively in power due to random reasons that have nothing to do with whether or not they understand the modern globalized world in which young Muslims are living in today. These are the new challenges facing us. The most important for us is to liberate the mind of the Muslims from intellectual stagnation. and the writings of this book, Wacana, Pemikiran, Reformis, and also contemporary Islamic discourse in the Malay-Indonesian world resemble our quest for this journey. Basically, Muslims require thinking and rethinking again about this important agenda. Man must be made able to exercise God's given rational faculty in order to face the challenges of modernity. All this forms the basis of reform that we aspire to. IREF is a voice of reason that promotes an intellectual discourse, reform and renewal in our society and this religion of Islam for this new age. In uridu illa al-islah mastata'tu wa ma tawfiqi illa billah. I desire nothing but reform as far as I am able. There is no guidance for me except from Allah. Surah Al-Hud, verse 88. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.